In the harsh Arizona territory of 1,880, Clara Bell Dawson found more than just a dying man by the creek bed. She found a choice that would change everything. This poor widow, with nothing but a broken-down mule and a heart bigger than her one-room shack, pulled an unconscious cowboy from the dust and brought him home to heal. His leg was shattered, his face bloodied, and his past darker than the desert night. But Clara had learned long ago that mercy doesn't ask questions first. She tended his wounds with her last drops of whiskey and willow bark tea, keeping him alive through the howling storms that rattled her thin walls. What she didn't know was that this stranger carried secrets that could destroy them both, set them free. When Jedediah Cross finally opened his eyes, Clara saw something that made her breath catch. Here was a man running from more than just the law. But would her simple act of kindness be enough to heal a soul as wounded as his body? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet painted the eastern hills when Clara Bell Dawson stepped out of her one-room cabin, her bare feet finding the familiar grooves worn smooth by 3 years of the same morning ritual. She paused at the threshold, her weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with chicory coffee. Real coffee was a luxury she hadn't tasted since before Thomas died. Her small homestead stretched before her in the pale dawn light, every inch of it a testament to stubborn determination and the kind of poverty that teaches you to find value in things others might discard. The vegetable garden, carefully tended despite the unforgiving Arizona soil, showed the first green shoots of beans and squash. Her chicken coop, built from salvaged lumber and sheer will, housed 6 hens that provided eggs when the mood struck them. And there, in the makeshift corral Thomas had started but never finished, stood Bessie, her mule, whose advanced age and cantankerous disposition made her nearly worthless to anyone else, but who had become Clara's most reliable companion. "Morning, girl," Clara murmured to the mule, who acknowledged her with a dismissive snort. Bessie had been with them since the early days, when Thomas still believed they could make something of this hard patch of desert. Now, with one blind eye and a tendency to stop mid-task whenever the spirit moved her, the mule was a mirror of Clara's own circumstances, worn down but not yet broken. Inside the cabin, 8-year-old Lily still slept on the narrow cot they shared, her dark hair spilling across the pillow like ink on parchment. Clara studied her daughter's face in the dim light, seeing Thomas in the stubborn set of her jaw and something of herself in the way Lily's small fists clenched even in sleep, as if she were already learning to fight the world's hardships in her dreams. The cabin itself told the story of their reduced circumstances with brutal honesty. What had once been Thomas's grand planner 2-room house with a proper kitchen and sleeping loft had been reduced to this single space that served as bedroom, kitchen, and parlor all at once. The walls were rough-hewn timber, chinked with mud and horsehair, and the single window was covered with oiled paper rather than glass. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney built from river rocks Thomas had hauled from the creek bed, where Clara would later find a stranger who would change everything. Clara's wedding ring caught the morning light as she set down her mug, and for a moment she allowed herself to remember. Thomas Bell had been a dreamer, full of plans and promises about the life they'd build together in this territory. He'd spoken of cattle and crops, of the railroad that would surely come through and bring prosperity to anyone brave enough to stake a claim. But dreams don't stop bullets, and prosperity had proven as elusive as rain in this desert country. She turned the thin gold band on her finger, a habit she'd developed in the 2 years since Thomas's death. The ring had belonged to his mother, passed down with the quiet ceremony that marked most milestones in their simple life. Now it felt loose on her finger, a reminder of the weight she'd lost during the hardest months after the funeral, when keeping food on the table had meant choosing between eating and feeding Lily. The stranger she'd found yesterday lay on Thomas's side of the bed, his breathing steady but labored. Clara had spent the night in the chair by the fireplace, dozing fitfully and waking every hour to check on him. In the growing light, she could see the full extent of his injuries more clearly. His left leg was definitely broken. She'd set it as best she could, using skills learned from her mother, who'd tended to ranch hands and drifters back in Kansas. The gash on his temple had stopped bleeding, but the bruising around his eyes suggested he'd taken quite a beating before whatever happened to put him by that creek. His clothes told a story of their own. The shirt was good quality cotton, though torn and stained with blood and dust. His boots were expensive leather, well made, but showing the wear of a man who spent his days in the saddle. Most telling was the gun belt. She'd removed the holster was positioned for a quick draw, and the Colt .45 was clean and well maintained, despite the dirt covering everything else. This wasn't a farmer or a shopkeeper. This was a man who lived by his gun. Clara moved closer to check his fever, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor. As she reached toward his forehead, his eyes snapped open, and his right hand shot out to grab her wrist with surprising strength for an injured man. For a moment, they stared at each other, she seeing wariness and something darker in his grey eyes, he seeing a woman whose kindness had pulled him back from death's door. "Easy," she said softly, the way she might gentle a spooked horse. "You're safe. I'm Clara. I found you by the creek." His grip loosened, but didn't release her. "How long?" "Day and a half. You've been fever, talking mostly." "Something about a train, and someone named Sarah." She watched his face carefully, noting how the mention of the name caused his jaw to tighten. "Your leg's broken. I set it best I could, but you'll need to stay off it for weeks." He released her wrist and tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through his injured leg. "I can't stay. People will come looking." "People are always looking for something out here," Clara said with a weariness that spoke of experience. "Question is whether you're worth finding." Before he could answer, a small voice came from the corner of the room. "Mama, is the cowboy awake?" Lily sat up on the cot, her dark eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. She'd helped Clara tend to injured animals before, and to her 8-year-old mind, this was simply another creature that needed their care. "Come here, little bird," Clara said, using the pet name Thomas had given their daughter. "This is Mr." She looked at the stranger expectantly. "Cross," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Jed Cross. Mr. Cross, this is my daughter Lily." Lily approached with the fearless curiosity of childhood, studying Jed with the same intensity she might give to a new foal. "You got hurt bad," she observed with typical 8-year-old bluntness. "Mama used all the good whiskey on you." Despite his pain, Jed's mouth quirked into what might have been a smile. "I'm sorry about the whiskey. I'll replace it when I can." "Can't replace what we don't have money for anyway," Clara said, though not unkindly. She was stating a simple fact, the way she might comment on the weather or the condition of the chickens. As if summoned by the mention of their circumstances, Bessie chose that moment to bray loudly from the corral, her voice carrying all the indignation of a creature who felt her breakfast was overdue. The sound made Jed tense, his hand moving instinctively toward where his gun belt would normally rest. "That's just Bessie," Lily explained. "She's mean, but Mama says she's got good reasons." Clara moved to the stove, adding kindling to the coals that had kept their small fire burning through the night. "You hungry? I've got beans and cornbread. Not much, but it's warm." "I don't want to take your food." "You already took our whiskey and our bed," Clara said with dry humor. "Might as well make it a complete set." As she prepared the simple meal, Clara found herself stealing glances at their unexpected guest. There was something about him that spoke of education and refinement, despite his rough appearance. The way he spoke was careful, measured, as if he were choosing each word with precision. His hands, though calloused from hard work, were clean and well kept. This wasn't a common drifter or cowpoke. "You're not from around here," she observed, settling a plate of beans and cornbread within his reach. "No, ma'am. I'm from back east originally. Been working in the territories for the past few years." "Doing what?" Jed hesitated, and Clara saw the internal struggle play across his features. Finally, he said, "I work for the railroad, or I did. It's complicated." Most things are, Clara said, settling into her chair with her own plate. But complicated doesn't always mean bad. Lily, who had been quietly listening while she ate, suddenly spoke up. Are you going to stay and help Mama? She works too hard. Lily, Clara said, a warning in her voice. But you do, Mama. You're always fixing things and carrying heavy stuff, and you get sad when you think I'm not looking. The simple honesty of the child's observation hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her cheeks warm, embarrassed to have her struggles laid bare in front of this stranger. But when she looked at Jed, she saw understanding in his eyes rather than pity. Your mama's a strong woman, Jed said to Lily, but everyone needs help sometimes. Papa used to help, Lily said matter-of-factly, but he got shot by bad men who wanted our water. Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She rarely spoke of Thomas's death, especially not to strangers, but Lily, with the uncomplicated honesty of childhood, had no such reservations. I'm sorry for your loss, Jed said quietly, and Clara heard genuine sympathy in his voice. It was 2 years ago, Clara said, as if the passage of time had somehow diminished the pain. 3 men came through, said they were with the railroad. They wanted to buy our water rights, said the railroad would need them for the new line they were planning. Thomas told them we weren't selling. She paused, the memory still sharp after all this time. They said they'd be back with a better offer. When they came again, Thomas was ready for them, but there were more than 3 this time. They killed him for water rights? Jed's voice was carefully neutral, but Clara caught the edge of something harder underneath. They killed him because he wouldn't be pushed around. Because he thought a man had a right to the land he worked and the water he needed to keep his family alive. Clara's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her fork. They burned the papers afterward, said there was no proof we owned the water, made it all legal and proper. Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring at his plate. When he finally looked up, Clara saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. It was a look she'd seen in Thomas's eyes just before he'd faced those men for the final time. Did you ever find out which railroad they worked for? He asked. Arizona Central, Clara said. Not that it matters now. Thomas is dead, and they got what they wanted. Maybe, Jed said quietly, and maybe not. Before Clara could ask what he meant, Lily had finished her breakfast and was studying Jed with the intense curiosity that had gotten her into trouble more than once. Can you teach me to shoot? She asked suddenly. Lily, Clara's voice was sharp with surprise. Mrs. Henderson says every woman in the territory should know how to protect herself, and you're too busy to teach me proper. Clara looked at her daughter, really looked at Herond, saw not the child she'd been trying to preserve, but a young woman who was growing up in a hard country where survival often depended on skills that would have been unthinkable back east. We'll see, she said finally, which was her way of saying yes without committing to it in front of company. As the morning wore on, Clara found herself drawn into conversation with Jed in a way that surprised her. It had been 2 years since she'd had an adult conversation that wasn't about the weather or the price of goods in town. He was intelligent and well-spoken, with a way of listening that made her feel like her thoughts and opinions mattered. But there were shadows in his eyes, and sometimes he would stop mid-sentence as if he'd remembered something painful. And there was the way he kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting trouble to come calling at any moment. As Clara prepared to check on the chickens and tend to Bessie, she found herself wondering what kind of man she'd brought into her home. Was he truly just an injured cowboy, or was there more to Jed Cross than met the eye? The cautious part of her mind, the part that had learned to be suspicious after Thomas's death, whispered warnings about strangers and their secrets. But the part of her that had been starved for companionship, that had spent too many nights talking to the walls and too many days with only an 8-year-old for company, wanted to believe that sometimes mercy was rewarded with more than just a clear conscience. Outside, Bessie brayed again, reminding Clara that the morning chores wouldn't do themselves. But for the first time in 2 years, she found herself reluctant to leave the cabin. There was something about the way Jed looked at her, something in his voice when he spoke to Lily, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, She wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Time would tell if that feeling was hope or foolishness. In the Arizona territory, the difference between the two could be measured in heartbeats. 3 days later, Clara found herself standing before the general store in Mesquite Springs, her hands trembling as she stared at the wanted poster tacked to the weathered wooden post. The face, looking back at her, was unmistakably Jed Cross, though the artist had captured a harder version of the man who'd been gently teaching Lily to whittle by her fireplace the night before. Wanted dead or alive, the poster declared in bold letters. Jedidiah Cross, murder and robbery. 500 reward. $500. More money than Clara had seen in her entire life. More than enough to pay off the debts that kept her awake at night, to buy seed for a proper crop, to give Lily the kind of life every mother dreamed of for her child. All she had to do was ride to the sheriff's office and turn in the man who'd been mending her broken fence posts and making her daughter laugh for the first time since her father died. "Mighty dangerous-looking fellow," came a voice behind her. Clara turned to see Walt Murphy, the store owner, approaching with his usual expression of barely concealed disapproval. Walt had made his feelings about her situation clear from the day Thomas died. A woman alone with a child had no business trying to work a homestead, and her stubborn refusal to sell and move back east was just proof of female foolishness. "I suppose," Clara managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Been asking around about him in town," Walt continued, clearly enjoying being the bearer of important news. "Seems he killed a railroad executive up in Flagstaff. Shot him down in cold blood during a business meeting. They say he took off with a strongbox full of payroll money." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. "That so? Sheriff's been in touch with the federal marshals. They're sending men down from Phoenix to help with the search." Walt leaned closer, lowering his voice conspirationally. "Word is, they think he might be hiding out somewhere in the valley. Got reports of someone matching his description seen near the old Jameson place." The Jameson place was only 5 miles from Clara's homestead. She forced herself to nod thoughtfully, as if this information was merely interesting rather than terrifying. "Well," she said, picking up the small bag of flour she'd managed to afford with the eggs her chickens had finally produced. "I hope they catch him soon. A killer on the loose isn't good for anyone." Walt nodded sagely. "You be careful out there, Clara. A woman alone, well, you're vulnerable to all sorts of unsavory characters." "If only you knew," Clara thought grimly as she loaded her purchases into Bessie's cart. The ride home seemed to take forever, every shadow potentially hiding a federal marshal, every sound possibly hoofbeats bringing lawmen to her door. By the time she reached her cabin, her nerves were stretched taut as wire. Jed was sitting on the porch step, his broken leg propped up on a wooden crate, methodically cleaning his revolver. The sight of the weapon in his hands made Clara's mouth go dry, but when he looked up at her approach, his expression was the same gentle one she'd grown accustomed to over the past few days. "How was town?" he asked, slipping the gun back into its holster with practiced ease. "Informative," Clara said carefully. She helped Lily down from the cart and sent her inside to play with the corn-husk doll Jed had helped her make the evening before. When they were alone, Clara pulled the wanted poster from beneath her packages and held it out to him. "Want to explain this?" Jed took the paper, his face showing no surprise. He studied it for a moment, then looked up at her with those grey eyes that had haunted her dreams. "It's not what it looks like," he said quietly. "It looks like you're a murderer with a $500 bounty on your head." The bounty part is accurate. Clara felt her knees go weak. She'd been hoping, praying that there was some mistake, some reasonable explanation that would let her continue believing in the man who'd spent the morning teaching her daughter to braid rope and sharing stories about places beyond the Arizona territory. "And the murder?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape as if seeing something beyond the scrub brush and red rocks. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "The man I killed was named Harrison Blackwood." He was a vice president with the Arizona Central Railroad, and he was responsible for the deaths of dozens of farmers and ranchers who wouldn't sell their land for his expansion plans. Clara's breath caught. The Arizona Central, the same railroad whose men had killed Thomas. I was working for the Pinkerton Agency, Jed continued, hired by the federal government to investigate reports of corruption and violence along the proposed rail lines. What I found was worse than anyone imagined. Blackwood had organized a systematic campaign of intimidation, arson, and murder. When legal pressure didn't work, his men would simply eliminate the obstacles. And you decided to eliminate him? I decided to arrest him. I had enough evidence to put him away for life contracts, correspondence, witness testimony. I arranged a meeting, told him I was a potential investor interested in the railroad's expansion plans. Jed's jaw tightened. He walked into that hotel room expecting to discuss another land grab. Instead, I placed him under arrest for conspiracy and murder. But the poster says you shot him in cold blood. I did shoot him, but not in cold blood. Jed looked directly at her, and Clara saw the truth of his words in his eyes. He drew on me when he realized what was happening. Said no half-breed agency man was going to destroy what he'd built. I gave him every chance to surrender peacefully. Clara absorbed this information, her mind racing. If what Jed said was true, then he wasn't a murderer. He was a lawman who'd been framed for doing his job. What happened to the evidence? Stolen from my hotel room while I was dealing with Blackwood's body, along with my badge and credentials. Jed's voice turned bitter. By the time the local sheriff arrived, all he found was a dead railroad executive and a Pinkerton agent with a smoking gun. Blackwood's men had already planted the story about me robbing the payroll. Why didn't you explain to the sheriff? The sheriff was on Blackwood's payroll. Half the law in this territory is bought and paid for by the railroad interests. Jed shifted his weight, wincing as the movement jarred his broken leg. I've been running ever since, trying to stay alive long enough to find someone in authority who isn't corrupt. Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. She'd lived through her own encounter with railroad justice, had seen firsthand how easily truth could be twisted when there was money and power at stake. Thomas had been branded a troublemaker and a drunk after his death, his legitimate claims to their water rights dismissed as the ravings of a man who couldn't handle his liquor. You could have told me, she said finally, and put you and Lily in danger? The men hunting me don't care about collateral damage. We're already in danger just by helping you. Jed nodded grimly. That's why I need to leave. Tonight, if possible. With a broken leg, you won't make it 5 miles. I'll make it as far as I have to. Clara looked at this man who'd spent 3 days gently integrating himself into their lives, who'd fixed more things around her homestead than she'd been able to manage in 2 years of trying, who'd made her daughter smile and given Clara herself something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. The sensible thing would be to let him go, to pack him some food, wish him luck, and pretend she'd never found him by that creek bed. The safe thing would be to turn him in, collect the reward money, and use it to build a better life for herself and Lily, somewhere far from the Arizona territory. But Clara Bell Dawson had learned that life rarely offered easy choices, and the right choice was seldom the safe one. What if you didn't have to run? She asked. What do you mean? What if we could prove your story, clear your name? Jed shook his head. The evidence is gone, Clara, and the men who took it have had weeks to cover their tracks. Maybe. Or maybe they got careless. Clara's mind was working furiously, remembering conversations with Thomas about the railroad's methods, piecing together fragments of information she'd dismissed as unimportant at the time. You said Blackwood was behind what happened to other ranchers and farmers. That includes my husband, doesn't it? Almost certainly. Then there might be more evidence. Thomas kept records, correspondence, things the railroad men might not have known to look for when they came through here. For the first time since she'd shown him the wanted poster, hope flickered in Jed's eyes. What kind of records? Letters, mostly. Thomas was methodical about documenting everything who came to see him, what they offered, what they threatened. Clara felt her pulse quicken as she remembered the wooden box hidden beneath their cabin's floorboards. He said if anything happened to him, I should take everything to the territorial governor. Clara, if you have documentation of Blackwood's activities, it could be exactly what we need to clear my name and expose the corruption. We? Clara raised an eyebrow. Jed had the grace to look embarrassed. I meant what I need to clear my name. No, Clara said firmly. You meant we. Because if we're going to do this, we're going to do it together. These people killed my husband, Jed. They've been terrorizing honest folks across this territory for months, maybe years. If there's a chance to stop them, to get justice for Thomas and all the others, then I want to be part of it. It's dangerous. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. Clara stood up, brushing dust from her skirt. Besides, you're not exactly in a position to do this alone. As if to emphasize her point, Jed winced as he tried to shift his weight, the broken leg clearly still causing him significant pain. All right, he said finally. Partners. Partners, Clara agreed, and felt something settle into place inside her chest, a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. That evening, as Lily slept peacefully in her cot, Clara and Jed pried up the loose floorboard near the fireplace and retrieved Thomas's carefully hidden cache of documents. By lamplight, they spread the papers across Clara's small table and began the work of building a case that might save Jed's life and bring justice to the Arizona Territory. Outside, the desert wind howled around their small cabin, but inside, two people who had found each other by the grace of Providence and the courage to show mercy began planning their fight against the corruption that had already cost them both so much. The pocket watch was tarnished silver, its surface scratched and dented from years of hard use, but when Jed opened it with careful fingers, Clara could see that the mechanisms inside still kept perfect time. More importantly, nestled in the opposite half of the case was a small photograph of a young woman with dark hair and eyes that held the same quiet intelligence she'd come to recognize in Jed's own gaze. "My sister, Sarah," he said softly, holding the watch so Clara could see the image clearly. They were sitting at her small table, Thomas's papers spread between them, but this moment of personal revelation felt more intimate than all their discussions about evidence and corruption. She was killed by Blackwood's men 2 years ago in New Mexico territory. Clara studied the photograph, seeing in the young woman's face the echo of loss that shadowed Jed's eyes. What happened? Sarah and her husband owned a small ranch outside Santa Fe. Good water, fertile land, right in the path of the railroad's planned expansion. Jed's thumb traced the edge of the photograph with unconscious tenderness. They were approached multiple times with offers to sell. When they refused, the offers became threats. "Like what happened to Thomas," Clara said quietly. "Exactly like what happened to Thomas. But Sarah was stubborn, got that from our father. She said no honest rancher should have to sell their life's work to line the pockets of railroad barons." Jed's voice carried both pride and deep sorrow. Her husband Miguel was more practical. He wanted to take the money and start over somewhere else. They fought about it. Clara waited, recognizing the weight of a story that needed telling. The night they were killed, Miguel had finally convinced Sarah to sell. They were planning to ride into town the next morning to meet with the railroad representatives. Jed closed the watch with a gentle click. Someone must have gotten word of their decision and decided it was too late for peaceful solutions. They killed them even though they were going to sell? Dead landowners can't change their minds, and it sent a message to other holdouts in the area. Jed's jaw tightened. The official report said it was Apache raiders, but I knew better. Apache don't leave railroad survey stakes driven into corpses as calling cards. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The casual brutality Jed described was exactly the kind of calculated intimidation Thomas had faced in his final weeks. She remembered her husband checking and rechecking the locks on their doors, the way he'd started carrying his rifle, even when doing simple chores around the homestead. "Is that why you became a Pinkerton agent?" "I was already working for them, but on different cases, industrial theft, bank robberies, missing persons. When Sarah was killed, I requested assignment to the railroad corruption investigation. Jed met her eyes. I wanted to be the one to bring down the men responsible. Clara understood that kind of determination, the way grief could transform into a driving need for justice. It was the same feeling that had kept her going through the hardest months after Thomas's death, the rage that had prevented her from simply giving up and moving back east. Over the next few days, as Jed's leg began to heal and he became more mobile around the homestead, Clara watched him interact with Lily and began to see glimpses of the man he might have been before tragedy shaped his path. His patience with her daughter was infinite. Spent hours teaching her to tie proper knots, showing her how to read weather signs in the sky, and sharing stories about places he'd traveled during his years with the Pinkerton Agency. "Tell me about the ocean again," Lily would say, and Jed would describe the vast blue waters off the California coast, the sound of waves against rocky cliffs, the way salt spray felt against your face during a storm. Clara found herself listening as eagerly as her daughter, hungry for descriptions of a world larger than the struggling desert homestead that had become the boundaries of her existence. But it was in the quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, that Clara saw the depth of his grief. She observed him sometimes in the evening, sitting on the porch step with his damaged pocket watch open in his palm, staring at Sarah's photograph as if willing her to step out of the silver-toned image and forgive him for failing to protect her. One evening, as Clara prepared their simple dinner of beans and cornbread, she found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "You blame yourself for what happened to her." Jed looked up from where he was helping Lily practice letters on a piece of slate. "I was supposed to protect her. That's what big brothers do. You were hundreds of miles away, working your own job. You couldn't have known what was going to happen. I should have paid attention, should have seen the signs." Jed set down the slate and turned to face Clara fully. "Sarah wrote to me twice in the months before she died. Said she was worried about the railroad pressure, asked if I knew anything about their methods. I was so focused on my current case that I just wrote back telling her to be careful and let Miguel handle the negotiations." Clara saw the weight of regret in his posture, the way his shoulders carried the burden of choices that couldn't be unmade. It was a burden she recognized, having carried her own version of it since Thomas's death. "I know something about guilt," she said gently, "about the way it can eat at you from the inside if you let it. You blame yourself for what happened to Thomas. Some days, I think about the fight we had the morning before he died. He wanted me to take Lily and visit my sister in Kansas while he dealt with the railroad men. Said it would be safer." Clara's hands stilled in their work of cutting cornbread. "I told him I wasn't running from my own home, that we were in this together or not at all. You couldn't have known they'd come back with more men. That's what people keep telling me. But if I'd listened to him, if I'd taken Lily and left, Thomas might have felt free to accept their offer. Might have sold the water rights and lived to fight another day." Jed stood carefully, his healing leg still requiring caution, and moved to stand beside her at the small wooden counter. "Or he might have been killed anyway, and you and Lily might have been left with nothing. Some fights can't be avoided, Clara. Sometimes standing your ground is the only choice that lets you live with yourself afterward." Clara looked up at him, seeing in his eyes the same struggle between regret and determination that she faced every day. "Is that what we're doing now, standing our ground?" "I think so. Though I'm still not sure it's fair to ask you and Lily to stand it with me." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Clara turned back to her cooking, but her voice remained steady and sure. "There's a difference." That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Clara and Jed sat at the table reviewing Thomas's documents by lamplight. They'd organized the papers into categories: correspondence with railroad representatives, legal documents related to water rights, and witness statements from neighbors who'd experienced similar pressure tactics. "Look at this," Clara said, pointing to a letter dated 3 weeks before Thomas's death. "Blackwood signed this personally. It's not just a form letter from some subordinate." Jed studied the document, noting the official letterhead and the heavy paper stock that spoke of corporate authority. He was directly involved in your husband's case. That's exactly the kind of evidence we need to establish a pattern of behavior. Thomas kept copies of everything, even his replies. Clara pulled out several pages covered in her husband's careful handwriting. He was methodical that way. Said you couldn't trust anyone to keep proper records but yourself. As they worked through the papers, Clara found herself increasingly aware of Jed's presence beside Hearth, where he leaned forward when concentrating, the careful attention he gave to even the smallest details, the respect with which he handled Thomas's belongings. There was something solid and dependable about him that made her feel safer than she had since her husband's death. "We're going to need more than this," Jed said finally, sitting back in his chair. "These documents prove Blackwood was pressuring your husband, but they don't directly tie him to the violence that followed. What about the other cases you mentioned? If we could find similar documentation from other ranchers and farmers who were killed or driven off their land, that would establish the pattern we need. But getting that information means traveling to other communities, talking to other widows and survivors." Jed met her eyes. "It means putting ourselves out in the open where bounty hunters and corrupt lawmen can find us." Clara felt her pulse quicken at the thought, but alongside the fear was something she'd almost forgotten: excitement. For 2 years, she'd been surviving, enduring, simply making it through each day. Now, for the first time since Thomas's death, she had a purpose beyond mere survival. "Then we'd better start planning our route," she said. Clara's mother's recipe book was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with flour fingerprints that told the story of countless meals prepared with love and careful attention. The book had traveled from Missouri to Kansas and finally to the Arizona Territory, surviving moves, hardships, and the kind of grinding poverty that made most luxuries impossible. But somehow, Clara had managed to keep it safe, and tonight she planned to use one of its most precious recipes. She'd traded 3 of her best eggs to Mrs. Henderson for a small piece of beef, and she'd carefully hoarded a precious cup of real flour and a thumb-sized piece of butter that had cost her more than she could afford. The cornmeal cake recipe on page 47 called for ingredients she hadn't been able to assemble in almost a year. But something about the way Jed had looked when he spoke of his sister made Clara determined to create this one perfect meal. "What's the special occasion?" Jed asked, watching her work at the stove with more care and precision than their usual simple fare required. "No occasion," Clara said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Just seemed like time for something better than beans and cornbread. Lily sat at the table, carefully copying letters onto her slate under Jed's gentle guidance, but Clara could see her daughter stealing glances at the preparations with obvious excitement. The smell of beef frying in their small iron skillet was rich and foreign in their modest cabin, and the cornmeal batter Clara was preparing would create the first real cake Lily had tasted since her father's last birthday. "My mama used to make this cake for special company," Clara said, measuring the cornmeal with the same precision her mother had taught her years ago. She said food was how a woman showed respect for the people who mattered to her. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than a simple explanation of cooking traditions. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she realized what she'd inadvertently revealed, but when she glanced at Jed, she saw understanding rather than discomfort in his expression. "Then I'm honored," he said quietly. As Clara worked, Jed continued helping Lily with her letters, but she could feel his attention on her movements, the way he watched her hands as she combined ingredients and tested the heat of her small oven with practiced efficiency. It had been so long since a man had observed her domestic work with appreciation rather than expectation that she found herself moving with more grace, taking extra care with each step of the process. "Tell me about your mother," Jed said as Clara slid the cake into the oven. She was a practical woman, had to be, with 6 children and a husband who was better at dreaming than farming. Clara settled into her chair, wiping flour from her hands with a clean cloth. But she believed that even poor folks deserved beauty in their lives. She'd save up for months to buy real vanilla for Christmas cookies or trade vegetables to the preacher's wife for enough ribbon to trim Lily's Sunday dress. "Sounds like someone else I know," Jed said, his eyes meeting Clara's with warmth that made her pulse flutter. "Mama always said that keeping a proper home was about more than just shelter and food." Lily piped up, proud to contribute to the conversation. She said it was about making a place where people wanted to stay. Clara felt her breath catch. She'd said those words to Lily dozens of times over the past 2 years, usually while they were struggling to make their poor cabin feel like something more than just a place to survive. She'd never imagined her daughter would repeat them in front of company, certainly not company like Jed Cross, who'd traveled the country and seen how prosperous people lived. But when she looked at Jed, she saw no judgment in his expression, only a deep appreciation that made her feel like her small efforts at creating beauty and comfort were valuable rather than foolish. "Your mama's a wise woman," he told Lily seriously. "Some of the finest houses I've seen were just empty shells because the people inside didn't understand what your mama knows about making a real home." As they waited for the cake to finish baking, Clara found herself sharing stories about her childhood, about her mother's determination to maintain standards even when money was scarce, about the way her parents had created a sense of abundance through attention to small details and genuine care for each other. "My father wasn't much for grand gestures," she said, stirring the small pot of coffee she'd prepared with their last precious beans. "But every morning for 30 years, he brought my mother wildflowers he'd picked on his way back from the barn. She'd put them in a mason jar on the kitchen table and act like they were roses from the finest garden." "Did they love each other?" Lily asked with the directness that only children could manage. "Very much," Clara said softly. "Even when times were hard, even when they disagreed about things, you could see it in the way they looked at each other." "Like you and Papa used to do," Lily observed, and Clara felt her throat tighten with sudden emotion. "Yes, like Papa and I used to do." Jed reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with his own, the gesture gentle and comforting. His skin was warm and calloused from work, but his touch was careful, respectful. "Tell me about Thomas," he said. "What was he like?" Clara looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how right it felt to accept comfort from this man, who'd entered their lives as a stranger, but who now seemed as natural a part of their evening routine as lighting the lamp or banking the fire. "He was kind," she said finally, "and stubborn, and completely convinced that hard work and honest dealing were enough to build a good life, even out here where the land fights you for every green thing that grows." "He sounds like a good man." He was, but he was also naive about how cruel people could be when money was involved. He thought if he explained his position clearly enough, if he showed the railroad men that he needed the water to keep his family alive, they'd find another solution. Clara's voice grew quiet. He never really understood that they didn't want a solution. They wanted him gone. The cake finished baking just as the sun was setting, filling their small cabin with the warm scent of cornmeal and butter. Clara served it on their few plates, cutting careful slices and trying not to think about how long it would be before she could afford to make such a meal again. But as they ate, sharing the simple pleasure of good food and easy conversation, Clara found herself thinking less about the cost and more about the value. This was what her mother had meant about beauty in poor folks' lives, moments like this, when scarcity gave way to abundance, when a carefully prepared meal became a celebration of connection and care. "This is the best cake I've ever tasted," Jed said, and Clara could hear genuine appreciation in his voice rather than polite flattery. "It's just cornmeal and molasses," she said, but she felt pleased nevertheless. "It's not about the ingredients," he replied, meeting her eyes across the table. "It's about the care that went into making it." Later, after Lily had fallen asleep and Clara was washing their few dishes in a basin of warm water, Jed approached her with careful steps, his healing leg still requiring caution. "Clara," he said softly, and something in his voice made her turn to face him fully. He stood closer than necessary, close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of soap and leather, and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that what you've done for me, what you're doing it, means more than I can properly express." "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." His hand reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. "You saved my life, Clara. Not just by pulling me out of that creek bed, but by giving me something to fight for again." Clara felt her breath catch as he leaned closer, his intention clear in the way his gaze dropped to her lips. She could stop this, she knew. Could step back, make some excuse about the lateness of the hour or the impropriety of such intimacy, but as his mouth drew nearer to hers, Clara found she had no desire to retreat. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and questioning, asking permission, even as it offered comfort. Clara responded without hesitation, her hands moving to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Jed rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to leave," he whispered. "Then don't," Clara replied, the words emerging before she could consider their implications. "It's dangerous for you and Lily if I stay. It's dangerous for all of us no matter what we do." Clara pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "At least this way, we face it together." In the lamplight of her small cabin, surrounded by the lingering scent of her mother's cornmeal cake and the promise of tomorrow's uncertainties, Clara Bell Dawson made a choice that would change everything. She chose love over safety, partnership over solitude, and hope over the bitter lessons that loss had tried to teach her. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song of endurance and survival, but inside, two hearts began to beat in rhythm, creating something new and precious in the harsh territory that had already taken so much from them both. Lily's handmade doll was a simple thincorn husks, wrapped and tied with scraps of faded blue cloth, with a face drawn in charcoal and hair made from unraveled rope. Thomas had helped her make it during the long winter evenings before his death, and she'd carried it everywhere since. A tangible connection to the father she was slowly forgetting, despite Clara's efforts to keep his memory alive. Now, as Clara watched her daughter carefully arranging the doll's makeshift dress, she saw Lily whisper something to the figure before settling it in the wooden crate that served as a makeshift bed. The sight made Clara's chest tighten, with a mixture of love and fear that the fragile happiness they'd begun to build with Jed might be torn away just as brutally as everything else had been. "Mama," Lily said, looking up from her play, "is Mr. Jed going to be my new papa?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it voiced the hope she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. She glanced toward the door where Jed was working on the broken corral fence, his movements careful but determined, despite his still healing leg. "Why do you ask, little bird?" "Because he fixes things like Papa used to. And he makes you smile the way you used to smile before Papa went away." Lily's 8-year-old logic was straightforward and devastating in its accuracy. "And because he looks at you the way Papa did." Clara knelt beside her daughter, smoothing the child's dark hair with gentle fingers. How could she explain the complexity of their situation, that yes, she was falling in love with Jed Cross, but that men with bounties on their heads couldn't simply become fathers and husbands, that happiness was a luxury they might not be able to afford? "Mr. Jed cares about us very much," Clara said carefully, "but his life is complicated right now. There are bad men looking for him, and that makes it dangerous for him to stay in one place too long." "Because of the poster in town?" Clara's blood went cold. "What do you know about a poster?" "I heard Mrs. Henderson talking to Mrs. Murphy at the store last week. They said there's a wanted man hiding somewhere in the valley, and that anyone who helps him could get in big trouble." Lily's eyes were too knowing for her age. "That's why the sheriff's men have been riding around asking questions, isn't it?" Clara felt the walls of their small sanctuary closing in. She'd hoped to keep Lily innocent of the danger they faced, but children in the territory grew up fast, and secrets were luxuries that poor families couldn't afford. "Yes," she said simply, "that's why." "Are we going to turn him in for the reward money?" The question was asked without judgment, with the practical curiosity of a child who'd learned that survival sometimes required difficult choices. Clara saw in her daughter's face the same pragmatic acceptance that had helped them endure the hardest months after Thomas's death. "No, little bird, we're not." "Good," Lily said firmly. "I like having him here. He doesn't treat me like I'm just a little kid who doesn't understand things." That afternoon, Clara's worst fears about their situation began to materialize. She was hanging laundry on the rope line Jed had strung between two posts when she saw riders approaching from the direction of town. Even at a distance, she could tell they weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with the purposeful formation of men on official business. "Jed," she called softly, not wanting to alarm Lily but needing to alert him to the danger. He emerged from behind the cabin where he'd been chopping firewood, his shirt damp with sweat and his face immediately alert when he saw the approaching riders. "How many?" he asked, moving quickly toward the cabin. "3, maybe 4. Clara's hands trembled as she continued hanging clothes, trying to maintain the appearance of normal domestic activity. "They're still a mile out." Jed disappeared into the cabin and returned moments later without his gun belt, having hidden it beneath their mattress. To any observer, he would appear to be exactly what Clara had claimed. He was a drifter she'd hired to help with repairs around the homestead. "Remember what we discussed," he said quietly as the riders drew closer. "I'm your cousin from Kansas, here to help you get the place ready to sell." Clara nodded, though her mouth felt dry as desert sand. They'd rehearsed this story, but she'd never imagined how terrifying it would be to put it into practice with armed men approaching her home. The riders were indeed law enforcement sheriff's deputy she recognized from town, accompanied by 2 men whose badges marked them as federal marshals. Their leader was a tall, thin man with a carefully waxed mustache and the kind of pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Afternoon, Mrs. Bell," the deputy called as they reined in their horses near her cabin. "Hope we're not disturbing your wash day." "Not at all, Deputy Morrison," Clara replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What brings you all the way out here?" "We're looking for a dangerous fugitive," the lead marshal said, his gaze sweeping over Clara, then moving to Jed, who had positioned himself near the woodpile with an axe in his hands. Perfectly natural place for a working man to be, but also a position that provided both cover and access to a weapon if needed. "I'm Marshal Garrett," the man continued. "This is Marshal Webb. We have reason to believe the man we're hunting might be hiding somewhere in this area." "What kind of man?" Clara asked, playing the role of a concerned neighbor. "A killer named Jedediah Cross. He murdered a railroad executive up in Flagstaff and made off with a considerable sum of money." Garrett's eyes remained fixed on Jed, studying his face with uncomfortable intensity. "He's considered extremely dangerous." "Doesn't sound like anyone I'd want around my daughter," Clara said, gesturing toward Lily, who had appeared in the cabin doorway with her doll clutched protectively against her chest. "Who's your friend there?" Marshal Webb asked, nodding toward Jed. "This is my cousin Samuel," Clara said without hesitation. "He came down from Kansas to help me get the place ready to sell. I can't manage it alone with just Lily to help." "Samuel what?" Garrett pressed. "Samuel Bell," Jed replied, using Clara's surname in a way that suggested family connection. "Clara's late husband was my cousin, felt obligated to help his widow get back on her feet." "You have any identification, Samuel?" "Lost my papers in a river crossing 2 weeks back," Jed said with exactly the right mixture of embarrassment and irritation. "Damn fool horse spooked at a snake and dumped me and my saddlebags right in the drink." It was a common enough mishap in territory where river crossings were treacherous and paperwork was often the first casualty of frontier life. Clara held her breath, waiting to see if the marshals would accept the explanation. "Where in Kansas?" Webb asked. "Lawrence," Jed replied without hesitation. "Worked a farm there until the drought killed everything that wasn't already eaten by grasshoppers." Garrett dismounted and approached Jed with casual authority. "Mind if I take a closer look at you, Samuel? This cross fellow might have changed his appearance, and we can't be too careful." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as the marshal circled Jed like a predator evaluating prey. She forced herself to continue hanging laundry, playing the role of a woman whose only concern was completing her domestic chores. "You're about the right height," Garrett mused, "and the build is similar, but Cross is supposed to have a scar on his left hand from a knife fight." Jed held out both hands for inspection, and Clara nearly fainted with relief when she remembered that his only significant scar was hidden beneath the bandage, still wrapped around his healing wrister. Legitimate injury from his fall that provided perfect cover. "Just rope burns and calluses," Jed said mildly. "Nothing as interesting as a knife fight." "What about you, Mrs. Bell?" Webb asked, turning his attention to Clara. "You seen any strangers in the area? Anyone who doesn't belong?" "Just Samuel here," Clara replied. "And old Pete Jameson's been riding through every few days, checking on his cattle. But Pete's hardly a stranger. He's been in these parts longer than anyone." "Anyone else? Maybe someone who seemed hurt, or like he was hiding something?" Clara made a show of thinking carefully. "There was a peddler came through about a week ago, selling pots and notions. But he was old and bent over, walked with a stick. Didn't seem like the dangerous type." Garrett remounted his horse, apparently satisfied with their explanation. But as the three lawmen prepared to leave, he turned back with one final question. "Mrs. Bell, you wouldn't be thinking of harboring any criminals, would you? The penalty for aiding a fugitive is severe, especially when murder's involved." "I've got a daughter to think about, Marshal," Clara said with perfect honesty. "I wouldn't do anything to put her in danger." "See that you don't," Garrett replied. "We'll be back through this area regularly until Cross is captured." "And Mrs. Bell?" "There's a substantial reward for information leading to his arrest. $500 is more money than most folks in these parts see in a lifetime." After the lawman rode away, Clara and Jed stood in silence for several minutes, both of them trembling with the aftershock of fear and relief. Finally, Lily emerged from the cabin and ran to Jed, throwing her small arms around his waist. "I was scared they were going to take you away," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. Jed knelt carefully and gathered her into a proper embrace, his own hands shaking as he smoothed her hair. "They're gone now, little one. We're all safe." But Clara could see in his eyes the same knowledge that was growing in her own heart. Their time was running out. The marshals would be back, and each visit would bring increased scrutiny. Sooner or later, someone would recognize Jed, or their story would develop inconsistencies that aroused suspicion. That evening, as they sat around their small table, sharing another simple meal, the weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were living on borrowed time, and everyone in the cabin knew it. "We could run," Clara said quietly, voicing the thought that had been haunting her all afternoon. "Where?" Jed asked. "With a broken leg and a child to slow us down, we wouldn't make it 20 miles before they caught up." "Then what do we do?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, his hand absently stroking Lily's hair as she leaned against his shoulder. Finally, he spoke with the quiet determination Clara had come to recognize as his way of facing impossible choices. "We finish what we started. We gather the evidence we need to clear my name and expose the corruption. But we do it fast, before they close the net around us. And if we can't do it fast enough?" Jed met her eyes across the table, and Clara saw in his gaze both love and the terrible resolve of a man who would sacrifice everything to protect the people he cared about. "Then I leave," he said simply, "before they can connect you and Lily to me, before they can hurt you for helping me." "No," Lily said fiercely, sitting up straight and glaring at Jed with all the righteous indignation an 8-year-old could muster. "You don't get to leave. We're a family now." Out of the mouths of babes, Clara thought, seeing in her daughter's fierce declaration the truth they'd all been dancing around. They were a family now, bound together by shared danger and growing love. And families didn't abandon each other, no matter how dark the circumstances became. "Lily's right," Clara said firmly. "We're in this together, all of us. Whatever comes next, we face it as a family." The cavalry saber had belonged to Jed's father, carried through 3 years of war and a lifetime of service to principles that were sometimes harder to live by than to die for. Now it lay wrapped in oiled leather beneath Jed's few possessions, its blade still sharp, despite decades of careful storage. The weapon represented everything that had shaped Jed Cross into the man he'd become: honor, duty, and the unwavering belief that some fights were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Clara discovered the sword by accident while searching through Jed's saddlebags for the detailed maps he'd mentioned, maps that might help them plan their evidence-gathering expedition to other communities where Blackwood's men had operated. When she unwrapped the leather and saw the engraved blade, she understood something fundamental about the man who'd entered their lives. "Your father's?" she asked when Jed returned from checking the perimeter of their property for signs of additional surveillance. "Colonel Marcus Cross, 5th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry," Jed said, settling beside her at their small table. "He carried that blade from Bull Run to Appomattox. Never drew it in anger after the war ended, but he kept it sharp and ready until the day he died." "What did he teach you about fighting?" "That there's a difference between fighting for something and fighting against something, that a man who fights for his principles can sleep at night, but a man who fights only from anger will eventually lose his way." Jed traced the engraved inscription on the blade, "Honor above all," with careful fingers. "He also taught me that sometimes the fight chooses you, whether you're ready or not." Clara understood that lesson all too well. She thought of Thomas, who'd never wanted to fight anyone, but who'd been forced to take a stand when the railroad's men came calling. She thought of herself, a widow who'd wanted nothing more than to raise her daughter in peace, but who now found herself planning what amounted to a campaign against one of the most powerful corporations in the territory. "Tell me about the evidence," she said, focusing on the practical challenges ahead of them. "What exactly do we need to prove your innocence and expose Blackwood's operation?" Jed spread out his hand-drawn maps, pointing to locations where he'd documented suspicious activities during his months of investigation. "We need witness testimony from other families who were threatened or attacked. We need documentation of the systematic nature of the land, grab proof that this wasn't just random violence, but a coordinated campaign. And we need to connect it all back to Blackwood personally." "Exactly. The men who actually carried out the attacks were hired guns, expendable, but someone had to organize them, fund them, and direct their operations. That someone was Blackwood, but proving it requires more than my word against a dead man's reputation." Clara studied the map, noting the distances between communities and the rough terrain they'd need to cross. "How long would it take us to visit these places and gather what we need?" "At least 2 weeks. Probably 3 if we're careful about avoiding the main roads where marshals might spot us." Jed met her eyes. "Clara, I need you to understand what we'd be risking. If we're caught, you could be charged as an accessory to murder. You could lose Lily. And if we don't try, you'll hang for a crime you didn't commit, and Blackwood's successors will continue terrorizing honest families across the territory." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded Thomas's documents and prepared to pack them safely away. "That's not a choice, Jed. That's just different ways of losing everything that matters." Before Jed could respond, they heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Clara's heart leaped into her throat, but when she peered through their window, she saw a familiar figure riding toward their cabin. "It's my brother Daniel," she said, relief and apprehension warring in her voice. "He's 3 days early." Daniel Bell was Thomas's younger brother, a man who'd never quite forgiven Clara for taking his older brother away from the family farm in Kansas. He arrived at their door, travel-stained and irritated, his usual expression of barely concealed disapproval firmly in place. "Clara," he said without warmth, dismounting from his horse and barely glancing at Jed. "I got your letter about needing help with the harvest. Though from the look of things, you don't have much worth harvesting." "Hello, Daniel," Clara said carefully. "This is my cousin Samuel. He's been helping with repairs around the place." Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied Jed, and Clara felt her stomach clench with sudden fear. Thomas and Daniel had been close, sharing not just blood, but a resemblance that meant Daniel knew every detail of their family history. If anyone could spot inconsistencies in their cover story, it would be Daniel Bell. "Cousin Samuel?" Daniel repeated. "Funny, Thomas never mentioned any cousin named Samuel. And I know all our people from Kansas." "Samuel's from my side of the family," Clara said quickly. "My mother's nephew. You wouldn't have met him." But Daniel was too sharp, and he'd spent too many years resenting Clara's influence over his brother to accept her explanations without suspicion. "Thomas used to say your family was all back in Missouri, dead or scattered, said you were alone in the world when he met you." Clara felt the walls closing in around them. Daniel's arrival was exactly the kind of unexpected complication that could unravel their carefully constructed story. Worse, she could see recognition beginning to dawn in her brother-in-law's eyes as he studied Jed's face with increasing intensity. "You know," Daniel said slowly, "you look familiar, Samuel. Real familiar. Like maybe I've seen your face somewhere before." Jed stepped forward, with the calm confidence that had helped them survive the marshal's visit. "Could be you knew my father. Marcus Cross served with a lot of Kansas boys during the war. They used to have reunions every few years." "Cross?" Daniel's expression sharpened. "Your name's Cross, not Bell?" "Clara married into the Bell family," Jed said smoothly. "I kept my father's name. Man's got a right to honor his father's memory." It was a reasonable explanation, but Clara could see that Daniel wasn't satisfied. He'd always been suspicious by nature, and years of barely scraping by on the family farm had made him even more distrustful of strangers and their convenient stories. "I think I know where I've seen you," Daniel said suddenly. "There's a wanted poster in Dodge City with your face on it. Says you killed a railroad man and stole a payroll." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she watched 2 years of careful planning and growing hope crumble in the space of a heartbeat. Beside her, she could sense Jed calculating distances and angles, preparing for the fight that seemed inevitable. "That's impossible," Clara said, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Samuel's been here helping me for weeks." "Has he now?" Daniel's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and Clara saw the greed beginning to overcome his familial obligations. $500 is a lot of money, Clara. Enough to get you and Lily out of this godforsaken desert and back to civilization. "Daniel, please." "Sorry, Clara, but family or not, I can't let a killer walk free, especially not when there's reward money involved." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a summer storm. Daniel's hand closed around his gun butt, and Jed moved with the fluid precision of a man trained in violence. But instead of drawing his own weapon, Jed threw himself sideways, putting his body between Daniel and Clara just as the first shot rang out. The bullet meant for Jed caught Daniel in the shoulder, fired by Clara herself using Thomas's old rifle. Her brother-in-law staggered backward, his face a mask of shock and pain, while Clara worked the lever action and centered the barrel on his chest. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. "But you're wrong about Samuel, and I won't let you hurt him based on a resemblance to some wanted poster." "Clara, what have you done?" Daniel gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "What I had to do," she replied, "what Thomas would have done to protect his family." As Jed quickly bound Daniel's wound, and they prepared to tie him up until they could figure out their next move, Clara realized that their careful plans had just been shattered beyond repair. Daniel's arrival and recognition changed everything, forcing them to accelerate their timeline and take risks they'd hoped to avoid. But looking at Jed, seeing the gratitude and love in his eyes as he realized she'd chosen him over her own family, Clara knew she'd made the right choice. They were past the point of safe options now, past the luxury of careful planning and measured risks. From this moment forward, they would have to trust in each other completely, because they were truly alone against forces that would show them no mercy if they were caught. The war for their future had just begun, and Clara Bell Dawson was ready to fight. The surveyor's map was tucked inside a leather portfolio that Jed had kept hidden in his saddlebags since fleeing Flagstaff. Clara discovered it while searching for medical supplies to better tend to Daniel's wounded shoulder, and when she unfolded the detailed document, she felt the world shift beneath her feet with the force of terrible revelation. Her hands trembled as she studied the precise measurements and elevation markers, the careful notations about water sources and mineral deposits. Most devastating of all was the red circle drawn around a specific section of land, with coordinates that matched exactly the boundaries of her small homestead. "Jed," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from where he was checking Daniel's bonds. They'd tied Clara's brother-in-law to a chair while they decided what to do with him, and immediately saw the document in her hands. "Where did you find that?" "In your saddlebags. Jed, this is my land, my exact property lines." Clara's voice grew stronger as the implications became clear. They weren't just pressuring Thomas to sell water rights. They were after something much more valuable. Jed moved to her side, studying the map with growing understanding. "Copper," he said quietly, pointing to the geological notations scattered across the survey. "Maybe silver. The mountain behind your property shows significant mineral deposits." "How long have you known about this?" "I suspected something when I saw how specifically your husband was targeted, but I didn't have proof until now." Jed met her eyes, and Clara saw guilt and regret in his expression. "I should have told you what I suspected. They killed Thomas for copper?" Clara's voice was hollow with the weight of this new understanding. "Not for water, not even for the railroad route, for metal in the ground that he never even knew existed. And they would have killed you and Lily too, eventually," Jed said grimly. "Once they'd driven you off the land legally, or once they'd decided legal methods were taking too long." Daniel, listening from his chair with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Clara, what are you two talking about? What's this about copper and killing?" Clara turned to face her brother-in-law, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Daniel had always been quick to judge, quick to assume the worst about people whose choices he didn't understand. But there was genuine confusion in his eyes now, and underneath it, the beginning of fear. "The men who killed Thomas weren't just random railroad enforcers," Clara explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "They were part of a systematic campaign to drive families off land that contained valuable mineral deposits, and this map proves that my property was specifically targeted." "That's impossible. Thomas would have known if there was copper on the land." Thomas was a farmer, not a geologist. He knew soil and water and growing things. He never would have thought to look for metal deposits. Clara moved to the window, checking for any signs of riders while her mind raced through the implications of their discovery. But the railroad had surveyed this entire area. They knew exactly what was under our feet. Jed spread the map on their table, pointing to additional markings that Clara hadn't noticed initially. "Look at these other properties. The Jameson Ranch, the Morrison Farm, the Widow Peterson's place. All of them are marked for mineral content, and all of them have had problems with railroad pressure." "Mrs. Peterson sold out last month," Clara said, remembering the conversation she'd overheard in town. "Said she couldn't fight them anymore after her barn burned down." "Convenient accidents," Jed said darkly. "Just like the Apache raids that killed my sister and her husband, just like the random violence that killed Thomas." Clara felt a cold fury building in her chest, different from the grief and helplessness she'd carried since Thomas's death. This was the anger of understanding, of seeing the complete picture of how thoroughly they'd been manipulated and betrayed. "We have to expose this," she said, "not just to clear your name, but to stop them from doing this to other families." "Clara," Daniel said urgently, "you need to think about what you're saying. You're talking about taking on the railroad, the territorial government, maybe even federal authorities. You're one woman with a child. You can't win a fight like that." "Maybe not," Clara replied, "but I can try." Before anyone could respond, Lily's voice called from the cabin doorway. "Mama, there are more men coming, lots of them." Clara's blood turned to ice as she looked out to see at least 8 riders approaching from the direction of town, their formation and purposeful pace indicating official business. At their head rode Marshal Garrett, the man who'd questioned them days earlier, and beside him was a figure that made Clara's heart sink, Sheriff Wade Morrison, a man whose corruption was common knowledge throughout the territory. "Daniel," Jed said urgently, moving to untie Clara's brother-in-law, "if you want to live through this, you'll do exactly what I tell you." "Why should I trust you?" "Because those men aren't coming here to arrest me," Jed said grimly. "They're coming to silence anyone who might have seen that map." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes as he grasped the full implications of their situation. Whatever his faults, Daniel Bell was no fool, and he could recognize a kill-or-be-killed situation when he saw one. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Can you ride with that shoulder?" "If I have to." Jed quickly outlined a desperate plan. Daniel would take Clara's horse and ride hard for the territorial capital, carrying copies of the surveyor's map and Thomas's correspondence as evidence of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, Clara, Lily, and Jed would try to hold their position long enough for help to arrive, assuming Daniel could find honest authorities willing to act on their evidence. "There's a federal judge in Phoenix named Samuel Morrison," Jed told Daniel as they quickly prepared their materials. "He's clean, as far as I know. If you can get this evidence to him—" "I'll get it there," Daniel said firmly. "Clara, I'm sorry about—" "Apologize later," Clara interrupted, helping her brother-in-law mount her horse despite his wounded shoulder. "Right now, just ride." As Daniel disappeared into the desert, Clara and Jed made their final preparations for what they both knew would likely be their last stand. They moved Lily to the root cellar beneath their cabin, along with the original surveyor's map and enough supplies to last several days. "Whatever happens," Clara told her daughter, "you stay hidden until Uncle Daniel comes back for you, or until you're sure it's safe to come out." "I want to stay with you and Papa Jed," Lily said, using the name she'd begun calling him in private. "You will, little bird, but right now, you need to be our secret weapon. You're the only one who can tell people what really happened here if things go badly." As the riders drew closer, Clara found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple act of mercy pulling, an injured man from a creek bed, and choosing to help rather than walk away. Now, that choice had led them to uncover a conspiracy that reached from local law enforcement all the way to corporate boardrooms. "Do you regret it?" Jed asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Helping me that first day?" Clara looked at this man who'd brought both love and danger into her life, who'd given her daughter a father figure and herself a reason to hope again. Then she looked around their small cabin, at the life they'd built together despite the constant threat of discovery. "No," she said firmly. "I regret that Thomas had to die for other people's greed. I regret that Lily has to grow up in a world where powerful men think they can take whatever they want. But I don't regret choosing to help you, and I don't regret choosing to fight." Jed smiled, the expression transforming his face despite the desperate circumstances. "Then let's give them a fight they'll remember." As the sound of hoofbeats grew louder and Clara checked the load in Thomas's rifle one final time, she realized that her mother had been right about something else. Sometimes the most important choice a person could make wasn't about safety or comfort, or even survival. Sometimes the most important choice was simply about standing up and saying, "No more." And Clara Bell Dawson was ready to make that choice, whatever the cost. Clara's husband's rifle felt heavier in her hands than it ever had before, weighted not just with blued steel and walnut stock, but with the memory of the man who'd carried it through their early years together. Thomas had taught her to shoot with this weapon, patiently correcting her stance and breathing until she could put 3 shots through a silver dollar at 50 yards. Now, as she checked the action one final time, she prayed those lessons would be enough to keep her and the people she loved alive. "Remember what we discussed," Jed said quietly, taking position at the window that offered the best view of the approaching riders. "They'll try to talk first, make demands, maybe offer deals. But these aren't lawmen anymore, Clara. These are clean-up men, here to eliminate witnesses." Clara nodded, her mouth dry but her hands steady on the rifle. Through the oiled paper window, she could see Marshal Garrett and Sheriff Morrison in heated conversation with the other ridersmen, whose hard faces and casual brutality marked them as hired guns rather than legitimate law enforcement. 8 of them, she observed. How many shots do we have? Enough, Jed replied grimly. Your husband kept his ammunition well, stocked. They'd spent the previous hour preparing their small cabin for siege, overturning the heavy wooden table to create a barricade, positioning water buckets in case of fire, and creating multiple firing positions that would allow them to cover all approaches to their home. It wasn't much against 8 armed men, but it was what they had. Most importantly, they'd made sure Lily was secure in the root cellar, with clear instructions about when and how to emerge. The hidden space beneath their cabin was well concealed and stocked with enough supplies to keep a child alive for days. If the worst happened, if Clara and Jed didn't survive the coming confrontation, at least Lily would have a chance. "Clara Bell!" Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed across the desert air as the riders came to a halt about 50 yards from the cabin. "We need to talk." Clara moved to the door but didn't open it. "Say what you came to say, Sheriff." "We're here about your cousin Samuel. Turns out he's not who he claims to be." "Is that so?" "He's a wanted murderer named Jedediah Cross. Federal marshals have been hunting him for weeks." Morrison's voice carried the false righteousness of a man trying to justify his actions to himself. "You need to send him out here right now, or you'll be charged as an accessory." Clara glanced at Jed, seeing in his expression the same grim determination she felt building in her own chest. This was the moment of truth, the point where they would either stand together or fall separately. "I don't know any Jedediah Cross," she called back. "Samuel's my family, and he's done nothing wrong." "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Clara," Morrison tried again. "Send him out, and we'll let you and the girl walk away. You can start over somewhere else." "Like you let Thomas walk away?" Clara's voice cut through the desert air like a blade. "Like you let all the other families walk away when they wouldn't sell their land?" The silence that followed her words was telling. Clara could see the men exchanging glances, realizing that their carefully constructed story was falling apart. Marshal Garrett spurred his horse forward, close enough that Clara could see the cold calculation in his pale eyes. "Mrs. Bell, you're in possession of stolen federal documents and harboring a fugitive from justice. This is your last chance to surrender peacefully." "What documents?" Clara called back, though she already knew the answer. "Railroad survey maps that were taken from a murder scene in Flagstaff, maps that contained sensitive information about territorial development." So they knew about the surveyor's map. Someone had told them, or they'd deduced it from the timing of their investigation. Either way, it confirmed Jed's suspicion that this wasn't about law enforcement. This was about covering up a conspiracy that reached much higher than anyone had imagined. "I think you're confused, Marshal," Clara replied. "I don't have any federal documents, just my husband's personal papers." "Then you won't mind if we search your property to verify that claim?" Clara felt her pulse quicken. A search would quickly reveal their defensive preparations, not to mention the evidence they'd hidden in the root cellar. Once these men got inside the cabin, the charade would be over and the killing would begin. "I mind plenty," she called back. "This is my home, and you have no right to search it without proper warrants." "We have all the authority we need." Morrison's voice was growing angry, impatient. "Send out Cross and the documents, or we'll come in and take them." Jed appeared beside Clara at the window, making himself visible to the men outside for the first time since they'd arrived. "Why don't you come and try?" he called out, his voice carrying across the desert with quiet challenge. The effect was immediate and electric. Weapons appeared in hands that had been resting casually on saddle horns. Horses shifted nervously as their riders prepared for violence. The pretense of legal authority evaporated like morning dew under the desert sun. "Last chance, Cross," Garrett shouted. "Surrender now, or we'll burn you out." "I don't think so," Jed replied calmly. "You see, there's a problem with your plan. My evidence isn't here anymore." Clara saw confusion flicker across the faces of the men outside. Garrett spurred his horse closer to the cabin, close enough that she could have put a bullet through his chest without aiming. "What do you mean?" I mean, someone rode out of here about an hour ago carrying everything you're looking for. Survey maps, correspondence, witness statements. All of it headed for Phoenix and Federal Judge Morrison. Jed's voice carried complete confidence, the tone of a man holding the winning hand in a deadly poker game. You're lying. Am I? You want to bet 8 lives on that assumption? Clara watched the calculation playing across Garrett's face. If Jed was telling the truth, if the evidence was already beyond their reach, then killing the witnesses became not just unnecessary but counterproductive. Dead martyrs had a way of attracting the kind of attention that corrupt officials preferred to avoid. But if Jed was bluffing, if the evidence was still hidden somewhere on the property, then they couldn't afford to let anyone escape alive. Even if that's true, Garrett said finally, you're still a wanted murderer. The reward stands whether you're taken alive or dead. True, Jed acknowledged. But here's something to consider, Marshal. How do you think it's going to look when federal investigators start asking questions about why 8 armed men were needed to arrest 1 injured fugitive? How are you going to explain attacking a widow and her child? Clara felt a fierce pride swell in her chest as she watched Jed systematically dismantle their opponent's justifications. This was the man who'd been a Pinkerton agent, the investigator who'd built cases against criminals across the Western Territories. Even wounded and outnumbered, he was still thinking 3 moves ahead. Especially, Jed continued, when that federal judge receives a detailed account of how railroad interests have been systematically murdering property owners to access mineral deposits. How do you think that's going to play in Washington? Clara could see the doubt creeping into the faces of some of the hired guns. These were men who killed for money, not principle, and the smart ones among them were beginning to calculate whether the reward was worth the risk of federal investigation. But Sheriff Morrison had too much invested in the conspiracy to back down now. His corruption ran too deep, his complicity too complete for him to walk away and hope for mercy. Enough talk, Morrison snarled, drawing his weapon. Take them. What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency of men trained in violence. The first shots came from Morrison's gun, aimed not at the cabin but at the water barrels Jed had positioned outside attempt to deny them resources for a prolonged siege. Clara's response was immediate and devastating. Thomas's rifle barked in her hands, and Morrison pitched backward from his saddle with a scream of pain and surprise. She'd aimed for his shoulder, wanting to wound rather than kill, but the impact spun him around and sent him crashing to the desert floor. "Clara!" Jed shouted, and she dropped flat as return fire shattered the window above her head, filling the air with splinters of wood and fragments of oiled paper. Jed's own weapon spoke twice in rapid succession, precise shots that dropped 2 of the hired guns before they could take proper cover. But 6 men still remained, and they were spreading out to surround the cabin, using their horses and the sparse desert vegetation as cover. "The water!" Clara called out, seeing one of the gunmen moving toward their well with clear intent to poison or destroy their water supply. Jed shifted position, firing through a gap in the cabin's log walls. The man near the well spun and fell, clutching a shattered leg, but his partner immediately took his place, this time carrying what looked like a stick of dynamite. Clara felt her blood turn to ice. If they destroyed the well, not only would she and Jed be without water, but Lily would eventually die in the root cellar, even if she remained hidden. The thought of her daughter slowly dying of thirst galvanized Clara with desperate fury. She rose from cover and fired 3 times in rapid succession, working the lever action with the smooth efficiency Thomas had drilled into her during countless practice sessions. The first shot missed, the second caught the dynamite-wielding gunman in the chest, and the third took down the man trying to flank their position from the south. But her aggressive shooting had revealed her position, and bullets immediately began chewing chunks from the log wall beside her. Clara rolled behind their overturned table, breathing hard and fighting the adrenaline that made her hands shake. "4 left," Jed called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. "They're going to try to rush us now." He was right. Clara could see the remaining gunmen coordinating their attack, preparing to charge the cabin from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a sound, tactical decision. Even skilled shooters couldn't cover every angle at once, and the attackers were betting that overwhelming force would succeed where patience had failed. "Clara," Jed said quietly, reloading his weapon with practiced speed, "if they get inside—" "They won't," Clara interrupted firmly. "Lily's counting on us. But if they do, you need to get to the cellar. Protect our daughter." "Our daughter." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they were wrong, but because they were so completely, perfectly right. In the space of a few weeks, Jed had become not just her partner and lover, but a true father to Lily, and Lily had become his daughter in every way that mattered. "We protect her together," Clara said firmly. "All of us make it through this, or none of us do." Jed met her eyes across their small fortress, and in his gaze she saw love, determination, and the absolute commitment of a man who'd found something worth dying for. But more than that, she saw the iron resolve of a man who intended to live to fight his way through this desperate moment and claim the future they'd begun to build together. "Here they come," he said quietly. The final assault began with a coordinated rush from 3 directions. Marshal Garrett led 2 men in a frontal attack, while the surviving gunman attempted to break through the cabin's back wall. It was their enemy's best chance for success, but it was also the moment when Clara and Jed's weeks of preparation and growing partnership would either save them or fail them completely. Clara took the back wall, positioning herself where she could cover the weak spot in their defenses. Jed handled the frontal assault, his superior marksmanship and tactical experience, allowing him to engage multiple targets with deadly efficiency. The sound of gunfire filled the small cabin, deafening in the enclosed space. Cordite smoke burned Clara's eyes and throat. Bullets splintered wood and shattered their few precious possessions. But through it all, she and Jed moved with the fluid coordination of partners who trusted each other completely. When Garrett's charge reached their door, Clara was ready. When the gunman broke through their back window, Jed was waiting. And when the last hired killer tried to use Morrison's wounded body as cover for a final desperate shot, both Clara and Jed fired simultaneously, ending the threat with professional precision. Suddenly, the desert was quiet except for the ringing in their ears and the labored breathing of wounded men. Clara and Jed remained in position for several long minutes, waiting to see if any other threats would emerge from the surrounding landscape. Finally, when they were certain the immediate danger had passed, they emerged from their battered cabin to assess the aftermath of their desperate stand. 3 men were dead, 3 others wounded but alive. Morrison lay clutching his shoulder, his face grey with pain, and the realization that his corruption had finally caught up with him. "It's over," Jed said quietly, helping Clara to her feet. But even as Clara felt relief washing over her, she knew this was only the beginning. They'd won this battle, but the war against the forces that had killed Thomas and threatened their family was far from finished. Still, as she called softly for Lily to emerge from the root cellar, as she watched her daughter run into Jed's waiting arms, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. They were alive, they were together, and somewhere in the desert, Daniel was riding hard toward Phoenix with evidence that could bring justice to the Arizona Territory at last. Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison's badge caught the morning sunlight as he dismounted from his horse 3 days after the gunfight at Clara's homestead. Unlike his corrupt namesake who lay wounded and under guard back at the cabin, this Marshal Morrison carried himself with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to dispensing honest justice in a territory where such commodity was increasingly rare. Daniel Bell sat slumped in his saddle beside the federal marshal, his wounded shoulder roughly bandaged, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Behind them rode 6 additional federal agents, men whose hard faces and alert postures spoke of serious intent and federal authority that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief as she recognized her brother-in-law, alive and apparently successful in his desperate ride to Phoenix. Beside her, Jed straightened despite his healing injuries, the ingrained habit of a former Pinkerton agent acknowledging the arrival of legitimate law enforcement. "Mrs. Bell," Marshal Morrison called out as he approached their bullet-scarred cabin. "I'm Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison. Your brother-in-law has presented me with some very serious allegations about corruption in this territory." "Marshal," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the emotional exhaustion of the past few days. "I hope Daniel was able to make our situation clear. Clear enough that I brought a full federal investigation team." Morrison replied grimly. "Mr. Bell showed me survey maps and correspondence that suggest a systematic campaign of murder and intimidation directed at property owners throughout Arizona territory." Behind the marshal, Clara could see his agents taking custody of the wounded survivors of the gunfight, including Sheriff Wade Morrison, whose corruption would now face federal scrutiny. The sight of corrupt lawmen being arrested by honest federal agents filled Clara with a satisfaction she hadn't expected to feel. "Marshal," Jed said, stepping forward with careful dignity, "I'm Jedediah Cross. I believe there's a federal warrant for my arrest." "There was," Morrison replied, "but circumstances have changed considerably since that warrant was issued. Mr. Bell provided us with evidence that suggests you were framed for the murder of Harrison Blackwood." Clara saw hope flicker in Jed's eyes for the first time since their ordeal began. "Evidence? The real killers were arrested 2 days ago in Tucson, trying to spend marked bills from the payroll they stole after murdering Blackwood. They were quite talkative once they realized they'd been abandoned by their employers." Morrison's smile was grim but satisfied. It seems Blackwood discovered that his own subordinates were planning to cut him out of the mineral rights scheme. When he threatened to expose them, they decided he'd outlived his usefulness. "And the evidence against me? Fabricated by the same men who killed Blackwood and stole your credentials. They needed someone to take the blame, and a Pinkerton agent investigating railroad corruption was a convenient scapegoat." Morrison gestured toward his agents, who were efficiently processing the crime scene around Clara's homestead. "Your name has been cleared, Mr. Cross. The federal charges against you have been dropped." Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she watched 2 years of fear and uncertainty dissolve in the desert morning light. Jed was free, truly free, and the men responsible for Thomas's death would finally face justice. "What about the mineral rights scheme?" she asked. "Will the other families get their land back?" "That's why we're here with a full investigation team," Morrison replied. "The evidence you've provided gives us probable cause to examine every land transfer, every suspicious death, every case of intimidation across the territory. This conspiracy reaches much higher than local law enforcement, Mrs. Bell. We're talking about federal charges, congressional investigations, and criminal prosecutions that will reach all the way to corporate boardrooms." As if summoned by the mention of corporate responsibility, a new group of riders appeared on the horizontes, moving with the careful precision of men who understood they were riding into a federal crime scene. At their head was a figure Clara had never seen before, but whose expensive suit and obvious authority marked him as someone significant in the railroad hierarchy. "That would be Assistant Director James Carmichael," Marshal Morrison said, noting Clara's attention. "He's the man who took over Blackwood's position after the murder. According to our investigation, he's also the man who organized this entire mineral rights conspiracy." Clara felt her pulse quicken as she watched Carmichael approach. This was the man ultimately responsible for Thomas's death, for the suffering of dozens of families across the territory, for the systematic corruption that had turned the promise of territorial development into a nightmare of greed and violence. "Is he here to surrender?" Jed asked. "He's here to try to clean up loose ends," Morrison replied grimly. "Carmichael doesn't know yet that his hired killers have been arrested and turned state's evidence. He thinks he's arriving to oversee the final elimination of witnesses to his conspiracy." As Carmichael and his men drew closer, Clara could see the cold calculation in the railroad executive's face, the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to buying his way out of any problem. But she could also see something else, the beginning recognition that this situation was not developing according to his careful plans. "Federal agents," Carmichael called out as he reined in his horse. "I'm Assistant Director Carmichael with Arizona Central Railroad. I understand you're investigating some unfortunate incidents involving railroad property rights. We're investigating systematic murder and conspiracy," Morrison replied flatly. "James Carmichael, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and violation of federal territorial laws." The transformation in Carmichael's expression was immediate and telling. Gone was the corporate smoothness, replaced by the desperate calculation of a man realizing that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. "You have no authority here," Carmichael snarled. "These are territorial matters, not federal crimes. Murder in furtherance of interstate commerce fraud makes it federal jurisdiction," Morrison replied calmly. "And we have sworn testimony from your hired killers, detailing exactly how you organized and funded this entire operation." As federal agents moved to arrest Carmichael and his remaining associates, Clara felt a profound sense of justice finally being served. The man responsible for Thomas's death, for her years of struggle and fear, was finally facing the consequences of his greed and violence. Clara's land deed lay spread across Marshal Morrison's field table, its edges worn from handling, but its legal language clear and unambiguous. Beside it sat a newer documenta, federal validation, that confirmed not only Clara's ownership of her homestead, but her exclusive rights to any mineral deposits found beneath the surface. According to territorial law, Marshal Morrison explained, all mineral rights belong to the property owner unless specifically excluded in the original land grant. Your husband's claim was properly filed and legally sound. Clara traced the boundary lines marked on her deed with one finger, thinking of Thomas and the dreams he'd had for this harsh piece of desert. He'd never known about the copper and silver beneath their feet, had never realized that his struggle to build a life here was sitting on top of a fortune that men would kill for. "What about compensation?" Jed asked, standing behind Clara with his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "For the years of harassment, for Thomas's death, for the attempts to drive her off her rightful property. The railroad will be required to pay substantial damages," Morrison replied. "Between the federal civil rights violations and the criminal conspiracy, we're looking at compensation that should set Mrs. Bell up comfortably for life." Across the table, James Carmichael sat in federal custody, his expensive suit dusty and his corporate arrogance completely deflated. The man who'd ordered Thomas's death and orchestrated a territory-wide campaign of terror now looked like what he truly was, a common criminal whose greed had finally caught up with him. "The compensation won't bring back my husband," Clara said quietly. "No," Morrison agreed, "but it will ensure that you and your daughter never have to worry about money again. And more importantly, it will send a message to other corporate interests that the federal government won't tolerate this kind of systematic violence against honest settlers." As they spoke, federal agents continued processing evidence and taking statements from the survivors of the conspiracy. Sheriff Wade Morrison, still nursing his wounded shoulder, had been singing like a canary once he realized that cooperation might reduce his eventual sentence. His detailed confession was providing investigators with names, dates, and locations that would help them unravel the full extent of the corruption. "What happens to the other families?" Clara asked. "The ones who were driven off their land or killed for refusing to sell?" "Every case will be reviewed," Morrison promised. "Where families were illegally forced from their property, we'll work to restore their claims. Where compensation is due for wrongful death or property damage, the railroad will pay." Clara thought of Mrs. Peterson, who'd sold her ranch after her barn burned down. Of the Morrison family, whose farm had been abandoned after midnight raids by masked men. Of all the families who'd been terrorized into submission by Carmichael's systematic campaign of violence. "How many people died because of this conspiracy?" she asked. Morrison consulted his notes, his expression grim. "At least 37 confirmed deaths across Arizona and New Mexico territories, probably more that we'll never be able to prove." The number hit Clara like a physical blow. 37 people, farmers, ranchers, merchants, families all murdered, For the sake of mineral deposits they probably never knew existed beneath their land. Thomas had been just one victim in a campaign of terror that stretched across the entire Southwest. "Will there be trials?" Jed asked. "Federal trials," Morrison confirmed. "In Phoenix, with federal judges and juries drawn from outside the territory. Men like Carmichael won't be able to buy their way out of justice this time." As if responding to his name, Carmichael finally spoke up from his position in custody. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man facing the collapse of everything he'd built. "The development of this territory requires capital investment, requires men willing to take risks and make hard decisions. Murder isn't a business decision," Clara said, turning to face the man responsible for so much suffering. "Taking a man's life, orphaning his child, destroying families, that's not development, that's just greed." "You don't understand the larger picture," Carmichael insisted. "The railroad brings civilization, commerce, progress. A few individual sacrifices are unfortunate, but necessary for the greater good." "Tell that to my daughter," Clara replied coldly. "Tell her that her father's death was a necessary sacrifice for your greater good." Carmichael fell silent, perhaps finally recognizing that his corporate justifications sounded hollow in the face of the human cost of his actions. "The greater good," Marshal Morrison said with disgust, "doesn't require murder and conspiracy. Legitimate business development happens through legal means, fair compensation, and honest dealing. What you organized wasn't development, it was organized crime." As the morning wore on, Clara found herself thinking less about revenge and more about justice. Carmichael would face trial and almost certainly spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The other conspirators would face similar fates. The families who'd suffered would receive compensation and, in many cases, the return of their stolen property. But perhaps most importantly, the precedent being set would protect other settlers from similar campaigns of terror. The federal government was sending a clear message that corporate interests couldn't simply murder their way to profits, that territorial development would happen according to law rather than at gunpoint. "Mrs. Bell," Marshal Morrison said as his agents prepared to transport their prisoners to Phoenix for trial, "I want you to know that your courage in fighting this conspiracy has probably saved dozens of lives. Other families won't have to go through what you've endured." Clara looked around at her bullet-scarred homestead, thinking of the price she'd paid for this victory. But as she felt Jed's strong hand squeeze her shoulder and saw Lily playing safely in the sunshine, she realized that some fights were worth winning regardless of the cost. Justice had finally come to the Arizona territory, and it had arrived bearing Clara's land deed, validated and unshakable, proof that sometimes the law could triumph over greed and violence. Thomas would have been proud. 1 year later, the family photograph was a testament to transformation that bordered on miraculous. Clara stood in the center, wearing a dress of deep blue wool that complemented her eyes, and spoke of prosperity earned through courage rather than inherited through luck. To her right, Jed wore the clean uniform of a federal marshal, his badge catching the photographer's flash with the same bright gleam it had carried during his swearing-in ceremony 6 months earlier. And between them, growing tall and confident, stood Lilino, longer the frightened child who'd hidden in root cellars, but a young woman of 9 who looked at the world with clear eyes and unshakable faith in the adults who protected her. Clara's hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew strong and healthy. The baby would arrive in the spring, born into a world where justice had triumphed over greed and where the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. The photographer, a traveling professional from Phoenix, had set up his equipment in front of their new house, a proper 2-story structure with glass windows, a stone foundation, and enough rooms for a growing family. The money from the federal settlement had paid for the construction, but it was love and determination that had made it a true home. "Hold still now," the photographer called out, his head disappearing beneath the black cloth of his camera. "This needs to be perfect for posterity." Clara smiled at that word posterity, A year ago, she'd lived day to day, never certain whether she and Lily would survive another week. Now she was thinking about the legacy they would leave for children not yet born, about the story this photograph would tell to grandchildren who would grow up free from the fear that had once shadowed every moment of their lives. Behind them, the homestead showed signs of prosperity that would have seemed impossible during those desperate months when survival was their only goal. The vegetable garden sprawled green and abundant, irrigated by a proper well system that Jed had installed, using water rights that were now legally protected and federally validated. The chicken coop had been expanded to house 24 birds, and a small herd of cattle grazed in pastures that had been barren scrubland when Clara first found Jed by the creek bed. Most significantly, the copper mine that had started all their troubles now operated under Clara's direct ownership, managed by honest foremen and paying wages that allowed former victims of the railroad conspiracy to rebuild their lives with dignity. The irony wasn't lost on Clara that the same mineral deposits that had brought death and terror to her first family had now provided security and prosperity for her second. "Beautiful family," the photographer said, emerging from beneath his cloth with obvious satisfaction. "That's going to be a portrait to treasure." As they relaxed from their formal poses, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The trials in Phoenix had concluded 3 months earlier, with convictions that sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms across the West. James Carmichael was serving life in federal prison, along with a dozen of his co-conspirators. Sheriff Wade Morrison had received 20 years for his role in the murders, while several other corrupt officials faced similar sentences. Perhaps more importantly, the federal investigation had led to new territorial laws that protected property owners from corporate intimidation and ensured that mineral rights belonged to the legitimate landowners rather than to companies with the money to buy. Corrupt officials. "Papa Jed," Lily said, using the name that had evolved from childhood endearment to legal reality when Jed had formally adopted her 6 months earlier. "Tell me again about the ocean." Jed smiled, lifting his daughter, for she was truly his daughter now in every way that mattered and settling her on his shoulders. "Well, little bird, the ocean is bigger than you can imagine. Bigger than all of Arizona territory. Bigger than all the sky you can see from horizon to horizon. And it's blue like Mama's dress? Sometimes. Sometimes it's green like spring grass. Sometimes it's gray like storm clouds. And when the sun sets over the water, it turns gold and orange and red like fire." Clara listened to this familiar exchange with deep contentment, remembering the evenings when such descriptions had been their only escape from the harsh reality of their situation. Now they were planning to visit the California coast next summer, to show Lily the wonders that Jed had described, and to take their honeymoon that circumstances had never allowed them to enjoy. Mrs. Morrison, the photographer said, using Clara's married name. She'd taken Jed's surname when they'd married in a proper church ceremony 6 months earlier, with Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison himself serving as witness and half the territory's reformed law enforcement serving as guests. "Yes? I was wondering if you'd mind me asking about the story behind this photograph. I've heard rumors about some kind of conspiracy, about your husband being involved in cleaning up corruption in the territory." Clara exchanged glances with Jed, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of pride and humility that the past year had brought to both of them. They'd become something of a legend in Arizona territory, the poor widow who'd saved a falsely accused lawman, and together they'd brought down a criminal conspiracy that had terrorized honest settlers for years. "The story's simple enough," Clara said finally. "I found an injured man by a creek bed and decided to help him instead of walking away. Everything else just followed from that choice." "That's all? Just helping a stranger? Sometimes that's all it takes," Jed said, his arm tightening around Clara's waist. "One person deciding to show mercy instead of fear, kindness instead of suspicion. The rest is just details." As the photographer packed up his equipment and prepared to leave, Clara walked with Jed and Lily to the edge of their property, looking out over the desert landscape that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving. Now it looked like home, harsh, still, demanding still, but no longer threatening. "Do you think Thomas would approve?" she asked quietly, knowing that Jed would understand she was asking about more than just their prosperity. "I think Thomas would be proud of the woman you've become," Jed replied. "And I think he'd be grateful that Lily has a father who loves her as much as he did. And our new baby will grow up in a world where justice means something, where honest people can build honest lives without fear of being murdered for their troubles." Jed's hand moved to rest on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of their unborn child. That's not a bad legacy to leave. As the sun set over their thriving homestead, painting the desert sky in the gold and orange hues that Jed had described so many times, Clara Bell Dawson reflected on the power of simple choices. A decision to show mercy to a stranger had led to love, to justice, to a future bright with promise. Sometimes, she thought, watching her daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while her husband checked the security of their home, with the careful habits of a man who'd learned the value of vigilance, the most important choices were also the simplest ones. Choose kindness over fear, choose courage over safety, choose love over loneliness. Everything else was just details.